Hello, everyone. I'm Adrian Sanabria, host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast and founder of the Defenders Initiative. Welcome to this webcast sponsored by Optiv. I have two guests with me today. Rommy Hijazi, Senior Manager of Cloud Transformation at Optiv. How are you, Rommy?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about cloud security and helping deliver competitive advantage for folks. I'm excited about today's conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Also with us, Derek Nash, Principal Cloud Advisor at Optiv. How are you doing, Derek?
Great. Hope everyone's doing well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. I was just saying before we went live, very excited to talk about the intersection between security and IT. And today we're talking about secure cloud transformation. And before we jump into that, for those in the audience, I just want to direct you to the blue bubbles down at the bottom there. That first one there, I see somebody's already found it. They're sharing where they are connecting in from. I'm actually connecting from a WeWork in Times Square in New York City today. I'm traveling today, rented out this room to do the webcast. And you can ask questions there. And I'll bring in those questions within the context of the conversation that we're having. I find that is more useful than saving all the questions for the very end and missing that context of whatever we happen to be talking about at the time that the question occurs to you. So please drop your questions in there as we move along, and feel free to chat with each other. Drop in where you're connecting from, any of that in the chat there. I'll be checking that periodically as we go through the discussion. All right, let's get started here. And let's start with some context here. I've been around long enough to remember when cloud was new and it was something we're all going to migrate to, and we're all going to get rid of our data centers, right? Like we're just going to be 100% cloud. We didn't know how that was going to work, but we were going to shift everything in there, get rid of our data centers, and hasn't really happened, right? We just got more stuff, right? More and more stuff. Uh, Derek, I see you nodding. I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah.
How has this evolved from being, maybe a way we could make IT more agile, or, we could, I think in the early days, for some reason, people thought they were going to save money with the cloud. Didn't necessarily happen depending on how you were doing stuff. How has that evolved to today? How do you look at cloud transformation today compared to like the late 2000s, early 2010s?
Sure. Well, I am a big believer in the Gartner hype cycle. I think this was a perfect example of a industry that followed that, and cloud was going to solve all of our problems. It was going to make us toast in the morning as well when we got out of bed. And the realities were, we went through this peak of expectations and then into that trough of disillusionment where people realized, oh, this isn't necessarily going to be cheaper per se, or it's going to it's definitely going to shift the economic model at least. And it's maybe not going to deliver everything we thought it was going to deliver, or necessarily be as easy as we initially thought either. And I think now we're coming out of that. People understand the cloud a lot better and what it can do, what it can't do, what types of workloads are appropriate for the cloud, what types of workloads won't be, although we still help clients answer those questions today. I'm sure Rommy has some thoughts on that topic as well.
Yeah, no, I think Derek raises some good points. We always have this conversation around the cloud, and I think there's this understanding that the cloud is more than just another form of switch. When you want to think about the cloud, and I think for a lot of clients and a lot of organizations, what they're starting to realize is that value proposition is less about the savings that you get moving from on-prem to the cloud, and more about the ability to start delivering things faster to your consumers, the ability to reorganize yourselves and reorient not only your security teams, your IT teams, but your business overall to deliver an enhanced value proposition to customers. To be a little bit more specific, data centers, if you look at the early aughts and even into earlier the early 2000s, there's a lot of cost savings that are already taken out of data centers through virtualization and other advancement. So the whole thing around, well, I'm just going to move from on-prem, I'm going to lift and shift into the cloud, I'm going to get a boatload of savings. While true, it represents in by some models less than 1/5 of your value proposition. So that's why here today, our topic, and I'm sure we're going to dive into this momentarily, it is how do I make sure that my move to the cloud enables and allows me to achieve that expected ROI? How does it help me truly transform my business and unlock not only savings, but potentially new revenue streams?
Right, right. Yeah. And yeah, agility is the thing. I remember when we went through that trial of disillusionment, and I included a link to the Gartner hype or a Gartner hype cycle if you've never seen one, so you can see what we're describing here. But yeah, certainly I remember when we hit that point and everybody was like, no, it's the agility, not the, cost savings is not the reason you should be doing this. And you probably shouldn't be doing just a lifted shift into it. So with that, coming back to you, Derek, what are some of the common misalignments that we see between security teams, IT leaders, and the business side of things here? We might have seen some of these misalignments last week, right? When AWS had an outage, it was an opportunity to have some of this conversation between those teams, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the misalignments that we see today is the fact that oftentimes companies haven't really rationalized why they're moving to the cloud. And what we mean by that is what does it mean for them? How can it affect their business? What types of business advantages can they gain? What are the priorities in terms of moving to it? And then from an IT perspective, IT is always looking, and I break IT into two. We have kind of an ops function as well as a development function. And we have people wanting to ship software faster and build infrastructure faster. And we have then security that is really still very much in this position of playing catch up. And what I mean by that is they are much further behind in the transformation that needs to take place to capture some of the benefits that the business is looking for. And we can dive more into that later. In fact, I hope we have an opportunity to. Romy, what are your
Right.
thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're going to hear a core message of mine throughout our conversation here today. Cloud is now, for all intents and purposes, your business operating model. And to Derek's point, security is now kind of your control plane. What do you mean by that? What does a control plane really mean? Think about traffic, city traffic, right? Your roads, the traffic lights, going from one lane to security kind of becomes that control plane where it enables your business to kind of move at speed. So the way we do that, when you think about the cloud, again, we were talking about storage earlier, but what you really want to think about is automation. That's what cloud really is all about. And for security, that means security as code. How do we make sure that we have these automated rules built into the way that we work rather than something being bolted at the end, like Derek was talking about? How do we make sure that we build these rules in so that business and security can move at speed? And more importantly, what I'd like to kind of really call out when we're talking about the misalignment, it's really the idea around a shared goal, a shared North Star vision that IT, business, security, and the whole enterprise has around the cloud. I'll give you something like really simple. For a client of ours, they were a health care company. And for them, it was, we want to be a digital company that offers personalized patient experiences. It was a very simple North Star vision that kept everyone
Right.
aligned. And I think that's really important to have that alignment, one shared goal, and then one shared kind of metrics, KPIs, scorecard, if you will, so that everybody can review across these functions on a defined cadence.
Right? And everybody can map back to that. Yeah, Rami, earlier you were talking about cost optimization maybe being like 1/5 of the value prop there. What would you consider? How would you build out the rest of that, the other 4/5?
Yeah. So if I wanted to kind of take a look at the ROI profile for cloud, I'm taking a look at what we talked about earlier, which is, and again, this is by some estimates. It doesn't have, but take this as kind of rule of thumb. But you're kind of taking your IT cost savings or cost savings from moving from on-prem to the cloud, that and kind of the that could represent about 1/5 of your value proposition. 4/5 or 80% is really around how might the cloud, because again, it's all about automation. That's what you really ultimately want to come back to. It's automation. How do I help kind of further digitize my core operations? Coming back to my statement, cloud is your business operating model. That's what it is. It's helping drive that digitization of your core business, right? Helping automate redundant and manual tasks, whether they exist in IT, security, or on the business side. So it's digitizing your core. It's also around how do I help with the cloud now be able to ship product out faster to customers, right? What that enables me to do is now I got new growth opportunities, or I can drive innovation a little bit faster. I will share this. There is a stat, and I'm going to probably butcher this, but I think it was from the Harvard Business Review, HBR, that said something along the lines that I want this to resonate with folks, is that intangible assets made up something like 90% of the valuation of S&P 500 firms. What that means, and when we tie it back to the cloud, and we tie it back to security, I was talking as policy as code, security as code, it is that if you can enable innovation to kind of take place a little bit faster, if you can push products faster to market, that IP that you're creating, that is the true value of your organization, and that's enabled by the cloud.
Right, right. And it's interesting me being in a WeWork today, because it was, I think that's one of those things that at some point somebody was like, "Hey, wait a minute, like you can't, like, real estate is not code, right? Like you can't digitize real estate, so there had to be some, coming back down to the real world. Like, it's not a bad business. Last night I didn't have a place to do this webcast. I was able to jump online, reserve a room, walked right in, got it super easy. Like there's a lot of value in this business, but yeah, it's you have to realize like what you can impact and what you can't, with software and with that agility. Like when you say automation, I think efficiency and the ability to move in the market, right? You notice an opportunity in the market. If you can react to it in less than a week instead of taking a year, like maybe it would have taken us in the past, that's a big advantage for your business, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think just to building on your earlier question, building on your response right now, when you think about infrastructure as code, right? The idea that your cloud resources, they can be provisioned rapidly, and they're consistent and they're scalable, right? But every time we're having a conversation with a client, when it comes to cloud transformation, our first conversation really starts around, well, what are you trying to achieve? So in the healthcare company that I kind of alluded to earlier, for them, it was one of the big driving kind of important points for the CEO at the time was we want to be able, we see our kind of competitors being health plans to their patients, and we want to be able to do something similar, but we really want to personalize it, not only in terms of just the data that we have around each patient, but also to their language. Like in certain regions and geographies,
Right.
Spanish, they had a lot of Spanish speakers. So it was that level of personalization, that frictionless digital personal experience. And we spent like a half day workshop with that CEO. But think about it this way. If I am able to spend a little bit more time with my customers and understand what it is that they want, that is what cloud can enable, because it's taking that data, it's driving that automation of your business processes. It is helping you kind of create these journeys for each of your customers. That's what cloud is really trying to do, and it's trying to do it in that automated manner. So I know that's a lot to absorb, but my big takeaway over here for folks is a lot of folks stop by, some folks, not everybody, but some folks may think of cloud as just a storage center. It's so much more than that. It's about moving at speed. That's what it enables. And I think for security, it's how do we help move at that speed? Because cloud and the
Right.
tools around cloud are really easy to use. Go ahead.
Yeah, and certainly jumping back to you, Derek, I think you alluded earlier to secure by design and there's opportunities for security in the cloud as well, right? But we do need to be involved to be able to make that happen. It's some of what security needs or what regulation wants or compliance wants, we can build in, but it would help to have some input, I imagine, when things are being architected and designed. So maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the best. This is actually probably the best news for security teams if they're willing to take advantage. And what I mean by that is they are getting a seat at the table finally. This is something that security has wanted for years. And I would argue the client or the security teams that take advantage of this opportunity. And what I mean by that is I'll reuse an already overused term, but to shift left and get involved up front and begin to build guide rails or guidelines and guide rails versus checkpoints is very important. And what I mean by that is if you think that the security team is going to continue just to scan infrastructure and scan code before it goes to market, you have missed the point of the cloud and the type of transformation that the security team needs to do. You need to be a proactive partner. You need to be providing those guardrails through policy as code and security as code that allows developers, whether they are developing infrastructure or developing applications, to very quickly and easily do their work and do it in a way that is secure. I would go so far as to say if we are doing everything perfectly on the front end, the need to scan is becomes almost irrelevant or less valuable. And what I mean by that is we're never going to get rid of it. I would call it's our belt for our suspenders, but it is not something that we're going to rely on moving forward in this new digital age. We have to be far more proactive in our approaches. I know Romeo will echo that.
Yeah, go ahead, Rommy. Or just to throw in there, yeah, if we're going to have a seat at the table, as a lot of security folks have been asking for a while, like we got to be prepared for that. We got to have a plan, and the way you do security in the cloud is not necessarily the way that you do it in other places, right? There's more opportunities here, stuff you might have done manually, like compliance. I still see so much manual compliance work, and there's just no reason that you shouldn't already have a folder pre-prepared with all the evidence your auditor needs before they show up, right? Like you're not gathering that manually. You're not taking screenshots and stuff. You can just set up automation to have all, maybe not 100%, but pretty close, right? Like 95% plus of that stuff just sitting there waiting for your auditor.
Well, the infrastructure as code itself can be part of that documentation. That states how you've built the architecture, how it's been configured. Yeah. There are templates for secure configurations that are readily available. That all of that compliance stuff, if done properly, becomes far, far easier. And that should be music to everyone's ears, whether you're in security or you're part of a GRC team, knowing that you have that. And more importantly, that the tools that actually do that also tend to revert those environments back to that known good state if someone alters them. And that's a whole other area of discussion, whether we should still be using mutable infrastructure or we should be moving to immutable infrastructure as part of this as well.
Right. Yeah, Rommy, I see you nodding a lot. Anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think Derek hit it right there. It's if I may summarize it, it's build security in from your first commit. That's the idea. Don't bolt it on later. Build it in from first commit. Use a set of pre-approved kind of blueprints, right? Drive basic automation so that security kind of, again, helps you move at speed, right? Your policy as code are those automatic checks. They run in the build and deploy part of your life cycle. Also, from an identity perspective, it's also making sure that you are leveraging MFA and just in time just leveraging least privilege by default, right? That your sensitive data is encrypted, it is labeled, that you don't have secrets being leaked, or you don't have code commits that have secrets in them, right? So it's just driving that level of automation from first commit rather than bolting on later. That is where, again, the business can move at speed and you are not kind of exposing the enterprise to a large attack surface.
I think one thing before we move on from that topic is we're really talking about working where our developers and working where our infrastructure teams are already working and using the processes, DevSecOps processes, CI/CD pipelines. That is where we need to be. That is where we need to be integrating our tooling and our policies into those. If you stop a developer or a IT ops person as part of that workflow, it's much more well accepted because that is part of that workflow. CI/CD pipelines are designed to fail. They have unit testing. They have all sorts of testing and steps that go through those. And whenever they fail, the natural reaction is everyone swarms to fix the problem encountered. If that now is a security process or a security check or a compliance check, that's all part of the normal process, and people are far less resistant to it. But you have to be talking their language. You have to be operating at their speeds in order for that to be the reality that you will get out of the backside of that process.
Yeah, I think one of the big, one factor that I don't see enough people taking advantage of, Derek, you mentioned several of the things here, but back in the day, 10 years, when cloud was first built, we didn't have as much information about how breaches happen, about how security incidents happen. Today, we get a lot of information about it. We know that lack of MFA, that an open S3 bucket, that hard-coded credentials, like we know how a lot of these things happen. We know how attackers pivot and move internally. Right, and I think we should be taking advantage of that when we design and build stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And infrastructure as code even allows us to capture the exceptions to policies. I think that's something that a lot of organizations struggle with. They build an exception register as part of a larger risk register, and then they have to manually track that. Well, if you're using infrastructure as code tools and configuration management tools, a lot of them support that type of exception management within the confines of those tools themselves, which makes them part of that compliance package that we talked about, in other words, in the code itself.
Yeah.
Just on that point as well, in terms of there's a lot more, if you will, noise, if you want to call it, around security. We didn't have this visibility. It's also important to understand, like if you take a look at a CNAP platform as an example, this is a good example that we share with clients, right? The whole idea is that we're able to provide clients with this shared runtime and cloud context. But specifically, you're looking at trying to bridge the divide between your developers your runtime operators, right? And it's that security team that's stretched so thin trying to bridge that gap. So we leverage these CNAP platforms to help us kind of gain a little bit more additional monitoring and visibility across our environment. And yes, there's a lot more noise that's coming out now. And how do we kind of focus in on where the signal is? I will say this, a big challenge for security teams is developers speak different languages than kind of people that do logging and monitoring. And they can speak different languages than other folks within IT and security. For us as security engineers, we're trying to think about how do we get everybody staring at the same kind of context, and how do we kind of bridge that different language that different folks speak. Just want to call that out as kind of an essential security point for organizations.
Yeah, and I wonder, this question goes to both of you. We've already, this has kind of come up a couple times now, but I imagine is one of the big security challenges you see that the security team just isn't prepared for it. Like they don't speak that language. Like, they have trouble making that move from a waterfall in my own data center to agile in the cloud, DevOps kind of transition. Like, how much of the problem is that them just being unaware of, what you can do in this environment and how to work with folks that work at this speed and scale.
It's a good question. I think it's important to understand, coming back to like cloud as your operating model, that your security risks come from your operating model. It's not just there's no single tool for this, right? It's people, process, tech, right? It's your operating models driving these risks. I think some of the common risks that Derek can comment on this as well. Some of the common risks that we see is things like cloud sprawl, right? Where different. So I think 2/3 of cloud resources are provisioned outside of the purview of IT and security. So you have that sprawl. It's potential data breach, or data exposure. It's the CI/CD exposure that Derek was talking about earlier. It's configuration drift that occurs over time. These are some of the more kind of
Yeah.
common risks that security has to deal with. And what's in common with all of that? It touches every aspect of the organization. Security teams are just strained. So for us, it's, yeah, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but it's kind of talking about that kind of pre-approved blueprints that we were talking about earlier, right? It's trying to drive a
Yeah.
level of standardization and trying to drive a level of automation to help kind of address some of these common challenges.
And I imagine that's is that a relationship? Is that part of this relationship between security and IT, where before you even start building in the cloud, okay, like how do we ensure developers can move at the speed that they want to move without having a bunch of shadow cloud resources and people opening accounts, stuff that's not managed, that we don't have visibility on? Is that IT's job to do? Is that security's job to do? Is that something that they have to collaborate with each other on? Like how do you make sure that that's there?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if we're just having that conversation right now, the answer already is that it is already happening in your environment. So when we start to look at whether it's CNAP tools or CASB tools, cloud broker tools, we generally, I recommend that our clients take a crawl, walk, run perspective. What I mean by that is, first, gaining visibility. Second, understanding the risks from that visibility. And then third, starting to define and control things with policy. And I think you can take that same crawl, walk model and to take it beyond just shadow IT and software as a service, which software as a service is its own kind of beast to try to tame. But using that same model, I think, is important to apply as clients begin to get security teams begin to get engaged in this. Sorry, go ahead, Rommy.
No, I think you hit it right there. I think, put rules into your build, put the security rules into the build, and give your teams the ability to kind of have clarity around those pre-approved blueprints that cover 80% of your work, right? And help kind of create kind of a security tiered model, if you will, from like different environments where people can experiment in sandbox environments, as an example, so that you can move things faster. Let low risk work kind of move a little bit faster, and let some of the higher risk work that goes into development, staging, production, help that kind of get a little bit more focused. So, if I may, it's just a combination of, we keep coming back to it, right? It's just putting rules into your build. It's building out that policy as code. It's having those pre-approved blueprint that cover 80% of your work. And then it's kind of creating kind of a tiered model across sandbox, development, staging, and production with your security controls, so that things can you can be agile, right? Some things can move faster than others, and you don't need to slow things down.
So it sounds like having this diversity of environments for developers to play in and to discover and try things out and experiment. That you keep describing as a blueprint, sounds like this is probably a big ingredient in making sure that you're not slowing them down, that you're not getting in the way, per se. Is that right? Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah. It's giving people like a lab environment, right? It's giving people a place where they can trial, test, and experiment, right, and move things at speed. It's letting lower risk things move forward. Derek was talking earlier about like your CI/CD pipeline, right? Like having those automated policy checks around like secrets and encryption and internet access and right sizing, right? Like having those checks in place, I think goes a long way from security being a blocker to security being an enabler. And then again, like I was talking about, your blueprint patterns, like they should cover the vast majority of the work. So that can reduce lead times and it can reduce kind of or eliminate stage gates. So yeah.
I think
Yeah.
coming back to that common thing regarding infrastructure as code, by leveraging that, even in those lab environments at their fundamental level, and there should be more freedom in those lab environments. But when we start to move back into pure dev, where we're developing on those labbed out environments, having infrastructure as code ensures that it doesn't matter what stage or what environment the infrastructure operator or the development person is operating in, the environment is consistent. And what I mean, and the value in that is that when they move from one environment and have their code promoted, whether it's infrastructure code or application code, promoted to the next environment, like user acceptance testing and then to production, every step of the way they are guaranteed the fundamental configuration of that is sound, and that there's not going to be a bunch of security controls at the last minute thrown on it that potentially are going to break all of the work that they did up to that point. That is a huge savings. And if you can paint that picture to IT and to development teams, they will love that idea because they want to pull out their hair. In fact, that's what happened to me and Rommy. Operating in those environments, having had that happen at the 11th hour, security team comes in as the old ad we all like to joke about being, the business prevention department. Like, where were you guys up front? Yeah. Why didn't I have infrastructure? Why didn't I know I had to comply with these controls from the beginning? So there's a great advantage to, again, shifting left and embedding yourself into the existing processes that development and IT is already using.
Yeah. By the way, you got to drag this boat anchor behind you once you're in production. Yeah. So it's and just because early on I mentioned taking lessons from how we see attacks and incidents happen. Every time I see a breach and the company says, "Oh, it's okay, they just hit dev," I'm like, "Yeah, sure." Right? Like, sure, there's no path from dev into production. Like, that's just not a thing that I've ever seen. So, all the more reason to have some of those security controls at all the stages, right? Because I don't think I've ever seen a case where there wasn't a path from dev to production. There has to be for the code to flow through those stages, right? So you can't just treat dev as like this unsecured thing that nobody ever looks at.
Yeah, I mean, if we come back to like practical examples, if you think about how infrastructure as code is oftentimes instituted, let's just take a simple server and what that build might look like. We talk about building an operating system. We can apply as part of that infrastructure as code template that it's going to update itself. It's going to grab all of the patches. It's going to install a configuration management tool that's going to then configure the environments. Those configurations can also contain security configurations. We're going to harden the OS. We're going to harden the app. And there's plenty of templates out there that people can utilize that come from places like Center for Internet Security and their blueprints, or DISA STIGs, whatever it may be.
Yeah, STIGs.
Those can now be purchased and simply leveraged. That lowers, in many cases, the level of knowledge that may be necessary for our infrastructure folks to try to maintain, or let alone security trying to get an opportunity to actually have the time to institute those things. They just happen as the course of infrastructure as code is being built, as an example.
Yeah, if I may just build on Derek's question, when you want to think about those vulnerabilities, think about your kind of cloud native application development lifecycle. So think about from code. So that's when you're going to have your vulnerabilities like in the proprietary code itself through open source codes, packages, open source tooling. Like those are all vulnerable points just at the point of code that can enter your environment. Then you go into build, and that's where you can get like vulnerable images that can get created and deployed into your build. So, and then promoted into production. So it's taking a look at that entire kind of cloud native application development scan and understanding all the different points of vulnerability across that life cycle.
Yeah, and we even have more and more options pop up. Like there are several companies now that will hand you a pre-built secure image. If you're using containers, like with all the unnecessary stuff pulled out of it, and I mean, it's not necessarily the cheapest thing, but there are ways to kind of offload and outsource some of that vulnerability management work, some of that patching, and supply chain security maintenance and updating work. So it's nice to have
Yeah,
options, right?
but that same
Yeah.
model potentially introduce that same type of model, but let's say around code and the reuse of code and code modules, that also expands the potential risk because you don't always necessarily know the true source of those things or the security measures around how that code is developed and maintained and secured while it sits there. There's been some very interesting supply chain attacks, as I'm sure many
Oh
of
yeah,
our listeners are aware of. So,
And those tools, some of those most popular, the more popular open source tools, the reason why they're popular is by default they're so convenient, easy to use, and so fast, right?
right.
But they come at the price of security, errors, right? So it's kind of figuring out that balance because, yeah, it's a big source of vulnerabilities for your enterprise.
Yeah, yeah, and if you built this thing right, you've got really good asset management. And the moment you see, a list of npm packages that are compromised and have malware in them or something like that, you should be able to run that query against your own stuff and see where it is in your environment, right?
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. I'm sure
Yeah,
Microsoft would have liked those tools when we had some malware get into VS Code, as an example. So here we're talking about the actual IDEs we're using to build the rest of the environment
yeah,
were compromised. Luckily, that compromise didn't jeopardize the code itself, but it just as easily could have.
yeah. So something else that I think we've hinted at a little bit here that I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, but resilience is kind of top in mind for a lot of folks now, especially as ransomware groups and other criminal groups are kind of aiming to impact operations, impact revenue. We've seen a lot of big cases there where companies have been down for months even. So maybe talk a little bit about how security and IT can work together to improve resilience as well. Because the cloud, talking about infrastructure as code, this should be one of the easiest places to rebuild stuff if it gets broken, torn down, ripped up, encrypted. Whatever tactic the attacker is using here.
Yeah, it's another perfect. I completely agree. If we infrastructure as code and the use of it as an example is a resiliency feature in and of itself. But then you also have to look at how you're storing that code, how you're securing that code. That's
Right.
also great because most of this is going to be based on uh, you know, revision control systems natively. That's where most of this stuff is stored. And so having revision history and being able to revert back is key to not only getting out of things such as ransomware attacks, but also getting out of, bad code that shipped and being able to quickly revert back to a known good state, which also will obviously increase your resiliency. So there are many edges to that blade, and they all are generally beneficial in terms of building on resiliency. But as we all know, everyone wants 5 nines, but not everyone is willing to pay for 5 nines. And I know Romy in his practice on a daily basis has to help clients kind of balance resiliency against budget.
Yeah. I would say also part of resiliency is to build on what Derek's talking about. So he's talking about kind of having your backups in place. For us, it's also about having your continuous monitoring. So for us, it's all about how do you obtain a great degree of like control and auditability of your environment. That starts really with kind of having those continuous monitoring tools to watch for misconfigurations and drift, right? Because as kind of time elapses, kind of you want to be able to have some of your higher risk vulnerabilities kind of reach a state of auto remediation if that's possible. And so having that monitoring, having those tools in place is an important and essential part of kind of achieving resiliency. Another thing is also as well, like from an identity standpoint, like having automation to enforce, MFA for your admins, having scans for every commit to avoid the kind of leaked secrets and rotating keys. That's all part of helping close out the most vulnerable and common attack paths that you can face. And that's part of kind of increasing your resilience as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and there's also a bit of distance between the plan for resilience and BCP, and then executing that, right? And that's one of the things I still don't see as often as I would like to, where people are actually executing that stuff, and they know it's going to work because they've tested it and it does work, right? Not hopes and prayers.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say we've all kind of encountered that. But having true code artifacts related to that still is a huge improvement compared to the idea that if infrastructure were to truly blow up or be encrypted, that you would literally have to point and click and rebuild it all by hand and be subject to all of the same mistakes that you made earlier, but probably in a higher degree of numbers because you are being rushed to try to recover the business to a known, I'll just say operational state. I wouldn't even say a known good state. Also, that gives you the ability to review those configurations offline and figure out where you need to improve, and that can be part of your incident response activities as well as analyzing those environments and where those could be improved upon.
Yeah. Yeah, I've even seen that asked at the board level. They look at some of these other incidents and they ask, how quickly could we rebuild our IT infrastructure from scratch, right? And like if your head explodes hearing that, maybe you got some work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I don't want to trivialize it and make it seem like it's easy because it's not.
Right.
But yeah, it is. It is definitely a tall order, but much of the principles that we laid out here today really will help contribute to that and make it much easier. And the cloud providers themselves are getting better at providing you tools by which you can build more and more resiliency. Whether that means bringing things off-prem into the cloud very rapidly or potentially rebuilding infrastructure in other regions. There's our in for talking about AWS outage last week right there. But yeah, those are, again, if you fundamentally have it in code, you essentially have the infrastructure package and ready to go. That doesn't mean carrying out the activities to rebuild it is going to necessarily be easy, but it is a huge step forward in being able to do that.
Yeah, maybe if I can also to return back kind of to center back a little bit, we talked earlier about security is no longer just a gatekeeper or something to bolt on, but it is your control plane. So part of that is, building that alignment with IT, the business, and security around one joint kind of unified North Star vision, around a joint kind of scorecard for business, IT, and security, shared set of metrics that measures speed, that measure security and safety, and they measure costs as an example. And then having kind of, we talked about that operating model, that governance piece, having a governance mechanism that there is periodic reviews of your kind of key metrics. There is a council, like, when we build kind of these centers of excellence for our clients or any kind of governance model with our clients, we're always talking about having kind of your architects from different areas review, your established patterns that you've built, and having kind of weekly meetings, cross-functional meetings, kind of analyze how are we tracking against our defined metrics. That all helps you so that you don't have to like start from scratch if something bad were to happen.
Right. Yeah, and to Derek's point, there are things that are difficult technically, and then there are things that are not necessarily technically difficult. Um, but yeah, sure, we could do that. We just need triple the IT budget, right? It's like, sure, we could have five nines. Sure, like we could reboot the company in a day. But here's the bill that comes due. So maybe it's a good lead in for you know
Fine.
yeah, talking about financial transparency, like bringing that into the conversation because it is a constraint that security teams have to work around, right?
I would say it's honestly, genuinely, I would actually flip it. I would say security is your competitive advantage. You want sustainable competitive advantage. You want to really deliver long-term ROI for your customers, clients. You want to win in the marketplace. Security is your that's going to be your source of competitive advantage. Business is always going to celebrate the new service that's launched. IT is always going to prioritize kind of speed, but security is going to make sure that both the outcomes that the business is delivering and the speed that it's occurring at is maintained without exposing your environment. So, it comes back down to having that unified vision, because what you're going to do is be able to draw a connective line between the security investments that are being made and the actual ROI for clients. We talked earlier about, we've been talking a lot about CI/CD and like policy as code. And there are ways where security just quantifies, hey, we've reduced high vulnerabilities or critical risks by 40% by investing in these tools, as an example, or by investing in these processes, or by automating certain features. That's what we've done. And that reducing by 40% led to higher uptime, for instance, for a certain service. It led to no breaches taking place. Like quantifying that dollar value and showing the business how your investments are driving greater ROIs the way we want to think about it. Because I agree with you, a lot of CFOs in the finance organization may take a look and say, well, hey, here comes security with another big ask. So it's on us, and the imperative is on us to kind of share that, hey, this is an investment that you're making that's driving outcomes. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's having everybody play off the same scorecard, which goes into
Yeah.
finance as well. And I'm happy to talk about the
Right.
finance cloud as well.
So I think this would be a good point. Like we've discussed a lot of things here, but where do folks start? What are the kind of foundations that they start with here? Because I think I think it was Derek earlier mentioned, most of the people are right smack in the middle. Like they're sitting in the middle of the dumpster fire. They're not starting from scratch and about to adopt cloud. So kind of midway into this. Where do people start? What are those kind of foundational pieces that you start with?
I would say keep it simple, right? But keep it disciplined. So for us, tie your cloud to an overarching business goal. Start with one line of business, if you will. Don't start with the entire enterprise, because what happens is this is how cloud sprawl builds out, right? Well, everyone approaches it like a democracy, right? And I'm not saying that's not wrong, but like when it comes to cloud, business unit one, they want some use cases here. LB2 wants some use cases here. LB3, what happens is that you're investing, but you're getting incremental uplift because you're so spread out. Invest in a focus on a particular business line, focus on a particular business goal. Start there. Once you focus on that particular business goal, start to put key security rules into code so you can start moving a little faster. Then, what I kind of talked about earlier, align on that clear value thesis, that single value thesis, and align on a joint scorecard that the business, IT, and security can all align on. Build out, start out by building those blueprints. 8 patterns sometimes can be really helpful, that can kind of guide how new work can go from start to finish. Turn on some of those starter policy checks in your CI/CD pipeline for secrets and encryption, and internet egress and so forth, and enforce MFA for your admins. Try to start enforcing least privilege. Those are kind of some of the things that you can start with, but I can't emphasize this enough. Day one, sit down with the business, sit down together, grab half a day, do a workshop, and start with one business goal first.
Yeah, make sure you're speaking the same language. Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is we talk about people, process, and technology. I think a lot of this all starts with people, and security teams need to take inventory on what their true skills are. And skill uplift oftentimes gets overlooked. That's actually something that we work with our clients on. We have specific offerings around skill up leveling and things of that nature, and starting there and really taking stock and inventory on where your security team is and what its knowledge around the cloud is, and potentially realizing they're going to have to take a bit more of a developer mentality. And what I mean by that is starting to define things not in written policy, but in actual policy as code types of tools as well. So maybe that's a bit more tactical, but we have to understand our skill level before we start moving forward.
Yeah, and if I may, I'd be remiss. I know we're heading towards time over here, but I'd be remiss not to kind of issue a reminder that security is the leading or second leading, depending on which study you want to cite, blocker to scaling cloud and kind of fully realizing, maximizing the value of the cloud. One or two tied with it is finance. So I can't emphasize this enough, but having like those basic cost checks next to your security checks is really important. You got things that can drive your cloud costs are idle resources. They're oversized resources. Think of it this way: a lot of organizations, their IT finance department, they're used to measuring or forecasting cost based on a capex model. So in a capex model, you're able to forecast your costs with a relative high degree of confidence and accuracy. In an OpEx model like the cloud, there was a study done over here that your forecast could be off by more than 25%. If your average cloud bill for a medium to large enterprise in the US, I think last year was something around the neighborhood of $10 million, could be off. But even think about that, 25% to be off by 25% is a canceled business initiative. It's a canceled hiring spree. So I can't emphasize this enough. Having those finance checks next to your security checks, but also bringing procurement, finance, security, and IT together into your governance to kind of monitor your cloud costs and to make trade-offs on your cloud investments to unlock savings. That is such an important consideration for organizations, even those that are just starting on their cloud journey.
And they seem so linked too. Like you've got unmanaged, unused assets in the cloud. Removing them saves money. Reduce attack surface, save money. Shut stuff down when it's not being used. Right. That visibility that you need of what's in the environment, what's being used, that understanding of especially across all these different environments. Like if you've got a sandbox environment and there's an experiment somebody hasn't touched, in years that was using 100 GPUs, there's all kinds of opportunities there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also like different organizations operate differently. You got show back, charge back. That's more of a philosophical organization for each. That's more of a philosophical topic, I should say. Each organization has its cultural ways of working. So it can be difficult, right? Because the business is moving at speed. They're provisioning resources. they may not be thinking as much about the unit economics of their decisions. And you want to be able to
Right.
provide them with that insight, right? And that's why I would say part of your governance model, and again, as security practitioners here today, the big takeaway of our conversation is you're so much more than just security. You're really the competitive advantage architect of your organization.
Yeah.
You're the differentiator.
So you guys have already been doing an excellent job on final thoughts here. There's been violent agreement in the comments with a lot of what's been said today. The only real question that we've received, Derek, is what model PRS that is.
I saw it. God, you guys are going to hate me. I can't even remember the right model number. It is an SE. It is not a US based guitar. I do have some others in my collection that are worth far more than that one, but that's just my noodle machine that I grab when I just want to play for a few seconds. So
Yeah, bang it into some furniture, no big deal.
yeah.
Love it. I also love the call out talking about GRC engineering. There's I love seeing the term engineering applied to stuff that has traditionally been done and seen manually. And maybe as we just kind of wrap up here, just some thoughts on how do we know if we're doing it right? How do we measure success?
Um, you know what? It's a great question. Because we're engineers, let's treat our investments in the cloud and our spend in the cloud. Let's treat it like an engineering issue, right? So I think how you want to track success is, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that joint scorecard: speed, safety slash security slash cost slash ROI, if you will. Having that joint scorecard, sit down again with your business counterparts, with IT, with security, in a room, half day workshop, focus on one goal, create that shared scorecard. That is how you can quantifiably and qualitatively show and demonstrate success, and how, more importantly, we want to have conversations with finance that's not centered around, oh, your IT budget or your security budget went up from last year. It's no, security helped drive, increase customer loyalty by 10%. It helped drive customer retention by 15%. It helped drive an ROI of X%, and so forth. Those are the conversations we want to have with finance. And I think that would be part of your joint scorecard. I think that would be very successful.
If you notice what Rommy was doing there with his metrics, is that he's really telling a story. And if we're not telling a story with our data and what we're gathering and what we're actually measuring, then we've missed the whole point. So I encourage our clients and everyone out there to really focus on storytelling and being able to tell stories within the organization about the value that you are adding, and not only to the cloud, but to the overall business success.
Amazing stuff. Rommy and Derek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks to our sponsor, Optiv, for making today's webcast possible. And finally, a big thanks to the audience for joining us. Great chatter, great questions in there. We'll see you next time.